Thank you, and congratulations on a very successful conference so far. I'm going to talk about what is driving change and an accelerated rate of change in the economy today, then talk about how organizations, companies, individuals can prepare themselves for this faster rate of change. And then toward the end of the talk, I'm going to share some of the ideas I talked about earlier today with a group here on a theory that I have that we have this great untapped resource that we really need to get off the sidelines and into the game, an untapped resource that has been shunted aside due to some mistakes that we're making. And I'm talking about late bloomers. Raise your hand if you identify as a late bloomer. A lot of people do. So I'm going to get that toward the end of the talk. But first, I want to talk about what's really going on in the economy. This is Forbes, if you're not aware of Forbes. We've been around for a long time. I've been with Forbes since 1992, in my current role since 1998. This is a book I wrote on corporate culture and what companies can do to create lasting success. Same would apply with all organizations. This is a book I co-wrote a year later on successful teams within organizations. And then I try to, as much as possible, sit on boards and invest in those kinds of rapidly changing companies, because I think as a journalist, it's simply not enough to sit on the other side of the glass and put your nose up to the glass and try to figure out what's going on. You really have to have some skin in the game. So megatrend number one, I said that I would talk about 4 megatrends and then 4 best practices, and then at the end talk a little bit about this late bloomers thesis that I'm developing into a book. Megatrend number one, organizations will fail at a faster rate in the years ahead. They will fail at a faster rate if the economy is growing faster. If it's not growing at all, or if it goes backwards, it doesn't make that much difference. The rate of attrition in organizations is going to increase. This is an interview I did 2 years ago with John Chambers, who is the CEO and the chairman of Cisco, the big Silicon Valley company. He's now retired out of Cisco, and he said something very provocative. He said 40% of Fortune 500 companies would fail in the next 5 years. If you said that about all companies, if you said that about startups, exhausted family-owned companies, you know, flyers, roommates in student housing starting a company and not really thinking it through, if 40% attrition rate wouldn't be that much, might even be an underestimate. But when you're talking about large established companies with global footprints, that is a lot, 40% attrition in 5 years. Now, 2 kinds of failure. Failure can be death. That's pretty definitive failure. A lot of retail is failing right now. Death at the hands of Amazon, it is called. But a lot more companies and organizations are failing this way. I read an article just in the Sunday paper about how many churches across the United States, mainstream Protestant churches, simply they're existing, but they're existing at a lower level of attendees than they ever were before. They're hanging on. If you look at my industry, the legacy media industry, legacy newspapers, legacy magazines, we fit this definition. None of us have the kind of revenue that we had 20 years ago. It's just a fact of the matter. Some of us are gone. The daily newspapers in Denver have been assaulted. There's been a lot written about that, and the hedge fund that owns the newspaper here, and there's some interesting fights going on there. But lots of industries fit this definition. Let me tell you, as somebody who's in an industry like this, it's not as much fun when you're not making as much money, because you can't hire the people you want to hire, you can't give the raises you want to give, you can't invest in the future to the degree that you could before. So you can survive and not be dynamic anymore, and that would be part of the 40%. How to avoid the 40%? Well, the key thing is to understand the pace of change, and it is picking up. Technology is not slowing down, but speeding up. Now, Forbes is based in New York. I was born and raised in North Dakota, in Bismarck, North Dakota. Raise your hand if you've heard of North Dakota. All right. I love it. Sitting right up front. You're going to love it when I talk about Carson Wentz then. But I live in Silicon Valley. I've lived my adult life in Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley is a great perch from which to see this accelerated rate of change. Now, if you live in Silicon Valley, for the last 50 years, people have been bowing at the altar of Moore's Law. Gordon Moore was a semiconductor designer at Intel, before that, Fairchild Semiconductor. When he was at Fairchild in 1965, he observed that this very new industry, it was only 6 years old at the time, semiconductors, were improving at this phenomenal and predictable rate. They were getting twice as good every roughly 2 years at the same price point. And if you played that out over time, dramatic things would happen. And in fact, dramatic things have happened as silicon technology has gotten better over time. Not wildly in any 1 year, but steadily over time. When you're doubling every 2 years, we've gone from the first crappy little kit computers of the 1970s to a real industry of personal computers in the 1980s. We went to network computers in the 1990s. We went to the internet and then the World Wide Web in the 1990s. We went from flip phones in the 1990s. Before that, we went from big brick cell phones in the 1980s to flip phones in the 90s to smartphones, starting with the Apple iPhone in 2007. So this tremendous rate of progress that has dictated the pace of digital technology and dragging all other parts of the economy into this accelerated rate. Well, that's change enough for people to deal with. It's not been difficult. You can see what it's done to the newspaper industry, the magazine industry, and everything else. It's created a lot of disruption. Last year, at one of our Forbes conferences, an extraordinary woman named Diane Green, who runs Google Cloud, and in the 1990s co-founded a company called VMware, which is a very successful company even today. Diane Green said something so profound, I think people didn't get the full implications of it. She said there's been a step-phase change to a higher rate of evolution in digital technology, thanks to about 4 or 5 technologies all maturing at once. One of them is cloud computing, where you can rent on a minute-by-minute basis this incredible supercomputer power and not pay a lot of money. So you can be an entrepreneur, you can be a poor country, you still have access to supercomputing power. Artificial intelligence is growing leaps and bounds. Internet of Things, which is sensors and cameras everywhere. There are a lot of privacy issues around that, but the fact is the tens of billions of sensors everywhere in every supply chain, on every lamppost, in every city in the world today, feeding these enormous data troughs. And all of this has come together and has accelerated the underlying rate of technological evolution to about 60% on a cost basis every year. If you took a 60% rate of return in your 401k and you compounded it, you would be very rich. You could start with $1 and you'd be one of the richest people on earth after 10 years compounding at this kind of a rate. And this new engine of faster growth has led to some of the things I talked about. If you wonder why AI has gotten all the press it has over the last 2 or 3 years, and it's really been the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, AI, my gosh, you know, any of you see the movie about the code breakers in England, Alan Turing? The Alan Turing proposed artificial intelligence in the 1940s. MIT began offering artificial intelligence as a field of study in the 1950s. In the 1980s, you saw a lot of commercialization attempts at AI. So why in the last 2 or 3 years has AI and robotics and driverless cars and anything involving artificial intelligence, why is it just hockey sticked up and occupied so much of our attention? Well, it's because all these other underlying technological drivers are now running at a faster pace. So this is an incredible development for business, for higher education, for a society as a whole. When artificial intelligence is improving at about 60% a year, That is a game changer, the likes of which no generation of humans has ever had to contend with. Another disruptor is something called Metcalfe's law, the power of networks. This is Bob Metcalfe, who started a company called 3Com, computer networking company in the 1980s. He teaches at the University of Texas in Austin today. And N is a node on the network, and every time you add somebody new to a network, the number of connections on the network goes up by that formula. Well, what does that mean? Today in the world, there are 3.6 billion smartphones, 3.6 billion Samsungs, Xiaomis, iPhones, Google phones, phones you've never heard of that cost, $25 or $50 US, that are transforming telecommunications in Africa and the poorer parts of India. Half the world's population now is a cell phone. And when you have that many people, you have that many connections. I mean, it's an unfathomable number. If you wonder why ideas seem to appear out of nowhere today, it's because with that many human connections out there, people with common interests can find each other in a way they couldn't before. And really good things and really bad things result from that many human connections. Really good example might be crowdfunding, or people with common identities, common affinities, common passions can find each other. But people who want to blow up the world can find each other too. How is ISIS able to recruit people in the way they do? Because they exploit this technology. Now, that many human connections, you will find people with that common interest. So Metcalfe's law, based off of that many smartphones, has created these incredible things. You think about, let's say, a small college with 2,000 students. 2,000 students, everybody, assuming everybody has a smartphone, safe assumption today, there would be 2 million human connections running the Metcalfe's law formula. Or you go to, let's say, a big state university. Let's say it has 20,000 undergrads. 20,000 undergrads, everybody with a smartphone. If you notice, you go from 2,000 to 20,000, you're going up by a factor of 10. You're going up by a factor of 100 because of the exponential effects of Metcalfe's law. So you have 20,000 students, you have 200 million connections among the students. So students with common identities, common affinities, common passions can find each other today, and students who have mischief on their mind, and not just typical undergraduate mischief, but really dangerous mischief, can find each other too. Megatrend number 3, I see this every day in Silicon Valley, and the world looks at Silicon Valley and wonders what on earth is going on. Why does so much money flow into these technology startups, many of which are not making money and have no immediate prospects of making money? Well, it's happening, and what it does is it creates what I would call extreme valuation differences and asymmetric warfare. I'll explain what I mean. These are examples of companies that are born recently. Companies, Google was born in 1998, Facebook, I believe, in 2006, Uber, I believe, in 2010. Netflix didn't really start as a digital company. It started as you mailed in discs and you'd watch your television shows off of that. But they're recent companies. They're not of an older era. They're new companies. They're tremendously valuable companies. You look at the world's most valuable companies, the whole planet's most valuable companies in order of how much the company is worth, and they're all American technology companies. The lopsidedness of where they are is explained by the following. 3 are in Silicon Valley and 2 are in Seattle. Apple, Google, and Facebook are in Silicon Valley. Amazon and Microsoft are in the Seattle area. If you went to the top 10, you would find 2 Chinese companies in that list. You'd find Tencent and Alibaba. And if you've been around a while, if you're my age, you look at a list like this, the top 5, or you consider the top 10, and you go, well, where's Exxon? Where's JP Morgan? Where's Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company? Where are these stalwarts that used to be in the top 5 and the top 10? Well, they've been run over by these digital companies. Math SAT scores of at least one founder of the following companies. That's kind of stunning, isn't it? I'm going to get to that in a little bit and why, I mean, that's why that has set the tone for how we look at education and why it's gotten us on this crazy conveyor belt of early pressure and success. Because you look at these outrageously successful companies, and what do they have in common? They were all started by, or at least one of the co-founders, you know, obviously Steve Jobs, college dropout, you know, wasn't really a high test score, but Steve Wozniak was. Jeff Bezos even recruited the woman he eventually married by screening her SAT tests, and you can look it up in Brad Stone's story on the founding of Amazon. Sergey Brin and Larry Page at Google, Bill Gates at Microsoft, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook all have that in common. This is an example of the valuation differences. General Motors has been around forever, employs 200,000 people, far more than that when you consider the auto parts supply chain, dealerships, all the people who make their money one way or another off General Motors. It's easily 500,000 people, maybe 1 million people. Uber has about 10,000 full-time employees. Uber's last round of venture capital employees valued Uber at $72 billion. General Motors is a publicly traded company, 54. Why does this matter? It matters because Uber can make all kinds of crazy experiments to disrupt the marketplace, and General Motors has a hard time keeping up defending them. And General Motors doesn't have the luxury of going out and trying the same experiments. Because if Mary Barra, who is the CEO of General Motors, made experiments in the marketplace at the rate at which Uber does on a monthly basis, if she did that every year, and a large percentage wouldn't work out because those kind of moonshot experiments tend not to work out, and when they do, they're great, but most don't work out. She can't do that. And if she did that, the board of directors would have her head on a platter because Wall Street investors would demand it. So these older legacy companies in the United States and around the world are really at a capital market disadvantage. They simply can't make the experiments in the marketplace that the newer ones have. Pollster Mark Penn, who used to be, when Bill Clinton was president, was his go-to political poster, writes, "The old brick and mortar economy is being regulated to death. The new tech-driven economy has been given a pass to flout regulation and build vast value." You think of Uber and taxi cabs. There have been suicides in the taxi cab industry in New York because a lot of last-in taxi cab drivers bought their taxi medallion for $600,000, $700,000, $800,000. Now if they took out giant loans to do it, mostly immigrant families. Now if they were to sell their taxi medallion, they could sell it for $150,000. Now Uber came in so fast into New York and other cities that the regulators didn't have a chance to look what was going on. It creates asymmetric warfare. It leads to these repeated assaults on legacy companies that I talked about. Number 4, it leads to this inevitable conclusion that the corporate strength that organizations want to have, both for-profit companies, non-profit companies, publicly funded organizations like universities, is that sustainable advantage declines more rapidly than it did before, and therefore adaptability becomes commensurately more important. Because you have to replace sustainable advantage with something if you're going to stick around, and that has to be adaptability. Now think about whether that applies to individuals also. Of course it does. No matter what you learn in school, that information is going to be more perishable than it was for previous generations. And if you're going to be viably employed based on the education you had, you're going to have to become more adaptable. I think it's a golden opportunity for universities to really lead there, but we are fixated on STEM and SAT scores. It's kind of nuts, and I'm going to get to some of the damage that causes at the very end. Okay, 4 killer apps or 4 best practices to future-proof your organization and career. Well, number 1, you have to become digitally fluent. This is one of the best retail CEOs that America's had over the last 30 years. His name is Mickey Drexler. He was the CEO of a company called The Gap, and then he was CEO of a company called J. Crew. And he retired in 2017, and one of the best CEOs in all of retail said that he underestimated how fast technology was upending things. Remember, this is not a mediocre CEO. This is one of the best. He said, I wish I could go back 10 years knowing what I know now. You know, maybe he would have done things a little differently at The Gap and at J. Crew. Maybe, you know, in online sales and stuff like that, he would have done things that he didn't do at the time because he didn't understand the underlying pace of change. Which makes this really poignant is that all the while, over those 10 years, Mickey Drexler was on the board of Apple. He had a front row seat to all this change. And he still didn't see how it affected the retail industry as much as it has. Again, this is not a mediocre, this is the best of the best in retail clothing in the world, one of the best. Second is cultural clarity. All organizations, if you're going to have to be more adaptable, it means you're going to have to move faster as an organization. If you're moving faster, it means you can't org chart every decision that you make. You can't simply make decisions according to who is where on the org chart, because if you're trying to figure out who has the final decision on the org chart, you by definition are moving too slow, and you're sure as heck moving too slow compared to nimble startups. And the only way a larger organization can move fast is when everybody in the organization understands the basis of this organization existing, the underlying morality of that, and ethical basis of that organization, how we deal with people, how we have to make a profit, how we make a profit because we have to make a profit so we can reinvest in the future, but how we do it. If all of that isn't deeply understood by everybody in the organization, you can't move fast enough. And when I was researching my book, The Soft Edge, I kept coming up with this. A lot of good CEOs I was talking to talked about a triangle. A triangle of forces is a visual metric of how you create a really good culture. Tim Cook at Apple talked about that, and Fred Smith of FedEx really put it in detail that I understood, and I used his model in the book. But both Tim Cook of Apple and Fred Smith at FedEx, two completely different industries, two different generations of leaders, said the same thing. And this is what you want. In an organization, you have to have great strategy, you have to have great execution, and you have to have great values. Strategy is figuring out where you're going to be in 2 years, and 5 years, and 10 years. You know, what do you want to be when you grow up as an organization? What are the underlying factors that are bearing down on you? The underlying technological change vectors, the underlying new competitors, existing competitors. Where do you want to be in 2, 5, and 10 years? Execution is simply doing what you say you're going to do. If you set a sales goal, you meet the sales goal. If you set a cost goal, you meet the cost goal. If you set timeline goals, you meet those. If you set hiring goals, you meet those. Execution is simply meeting the goals, setting metrics, meeting them with today's tools, being able to look at the analytics of those, of your results, so that if you fell short of your goals, you can maybe figure out why in a way that you couldn't before. And values is simply what gets everybody in the organization up in the morning and coming to work beyond their paycheck. What gets them to go above and beyond. In a competitive global economy today, if you don't have that X factor, that value factor, you don't get anywhere. Now, the problem is, everybody talks a good game. I bet there isn't a CEO out there or a university president out there who doesn't talk about the values of this organization. There isn't an annual report or a brochure out there or a web page out there that doesn't talk about the values of this particular organization. And then push comes to shove, things get busy, And suddenly people put values on the back burner. That is the danger. And the execution takes precedent. This is an example of a once great company that got into real trouble, and now it's on its way to being a really good company, again under Mary Barra. But this is General Motors when it was at absolute peak in the 1950s and 60s. In the 1920s, Ford, was the dominant American automobile manufacturer. We go into the Great Depression of the 1930s, everything slows down, but General Motors edges ahead of Ford. World War II, cars weren't even made for a few years as the factories were deployed to the war machine. And then we came out, and General Motors is now way ahead. And this is General Motors in 1953. That's the debut year of the Chevrolet Corvette. Still a pretty interesting looking car, isn't it? I mean, maybe Jay Leno has one in his garage. Probably cost you $250,000 to buy a pristine model. They had one of the best CEOs that has ever walked the halls of a corporation. One of the great CEOs of the 20th century, Bill Gates, called him the best CEO of all time. There he is on the cover of Time. A man named Alfred Sloan. Why did Bill Gates think he was so good? Well, because he understood the product, he understood finance, and he understood the marketing, and he understood the values and culture. He had the whole 360 view of General Motors, and that's why he was effective. Now you get to General Motors in the 1970s and 80s. That's the 1986 Cadillac Cimarron. Some of you weren't even born in 1986, but those of you who are more my vintage remember this abomination of a Cadillac. We voted it one of the top worst cars ever. Now, it wasn't as bad as, say, a Yugo, if you're old enough to remember a Yugo, but it was a real disappointment as a Cadillac. And there was a reason it was a disappointment as a Cadillac. It was really a Chevrolet Cavalier with a hood ornament, but they charged twice as much money for it and tried to pretend that it was a Cadillac. And you didn't have the web. You didn't have social media then where people could say, that's a Chevy Cavalier. What are they doing? You take away the hood ornament and the leather-wrapped steering wheel, that's a piece of crap Chevy there, and they're calling it a Cadillac. What temptation? Was it stupidity or temptation that led General Motors down that path? Well, they had a series of CEOs following Alfred Sloan who came up through the finance department. And when you come up through the finance department, putting a hood ornament on a Chevy Cavalier and calling it a Cadillac sounds like a pretty good idea, because the profit margins are through the roof. And if you're thinking short term, and you're not thinking about the erosion of the brand and the values and the excitement of people who work at the company, it all makes sense. Well, this is the guy who epitomized General Motors in the 1980s, Roger Smith. If any of you saw Michael Moore's breakthrough documentary called Roger and Me that came out during that period, that was the Roger and Me. Fortune magazine said he was an accountant who built low-quality look-alike autos in a mountain of debt. Now, that's a tombstone. There we are with the Chevy Cavalier. They thought they could sell you a Chevy Cavalier with a hood ornament and call it a Cadillac and charge twice as much money for it. And they got into trouble. And it's taken them all this while even to get back. That's culture. Sometimes you got to make the trade-offs. You got to say that the short-term profitability isn't worth the long-term damage it's going to do to the culture, and it takes real leaders to do that. Third attribute is teams. Now, the co-author and I hired a researcher from Harvard Business School to come to look through neuroscience, sociology, cognitive research, a bunch of different fields. Say, is there anything out there that can add new information on what makes teams click in terms of size, diversity, all of those things? I mean, there's a lot of great anecdotal information on teams out there. Military teams, special forces teams, sports teams, musical groups. You find great examples of your favorite teams in whatever thing that you like, and you see that thing that they may be doing differently than other teams. But if you boil it down to research, what does research say? What are some quantifiable things where we can say, if we applied this, we would build better teams? even if the leader didn't change, even if our talent didn't get better, we'd be right off the bat better if we did just these two things. And there are two things, and one is size. You want to be small if you're a team. Now, I'm not talking about giant assembly line teams, but this is something Jeff Bezos at Amazon says. When he has people in a room to discuss a project of importance, whether we should get into a new market or get out of a market, we've got a problem with a client, how are we going to solve it? Whatever that is, you should keep the number of people pretty darn small. He calls it the two pizza rule, no more than two pizzas can feed. I guess he doesn't have a son like mine, but two normal people, I guess. I mean, you can do the numbers. It's not that many people. It's in the area of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people is what he's talking about, is an ideal composition of a team. And it goes back to Metcalfe's law that when you start adding members to a team, the number of connections that the members on the team have goes up exponentially or nearly so. And then what happens is gossip, misunderstanding, disagreement over goals, all of that starts happening very early when you just start adding a few people. Look what happens when you go from 12 to 16. All you've done is add 4 people, and you've almost doubled the connections, which means the opportunity for gossip and all that bad stuff happens. What breaks at the break point? Speed of decision-making, accountability, and trust. Optimal team size, according to a sociologist, a neuroscientist, and a cognitive scientist, it's like this. It's like a rock and roll band with a few, with an extra keyboard player and, and a backup vocalist maybe. It's not that many folks. Starbucks accomplished enormous things with 2 people who really thought differently. Probably recognize Howard Schultz on the right. The other guy's name is Howard also. His name is Howard Behar. Schultz is the one who's very competitive, analytical. He's even talked about jumping into the Democratic primary in 2020. We'll see. I don't know. I guess he has the idea that you never have to run for elective office and you can be president. I don't know where anybody would get that idea today. But we may see a lot of people trying that, and Howard Schultz is a very accomplished guy. But you know what he's not? He lacks some things. Everybody lacks things. Nobody is the perfect executive. Nobody has it all. And one of the things Howard Schultz lacked, and it may be a lack if he decides to get into politics, he's not the most empathetic person in the world. He's very analytical and competitive. Usually when you say, if I describe somebody that you know, and I said they're analytical, competitive, they have this hawk-like visage, the word empathy and compassion doesn't usually go with that kind of a person. And that's not a ding on them, it's just that empathetic and compassionate people aren't often your most competitive, analytical people. But in this case, at Starbucks, the empathetic, compassionate one was Howard Behar. So in the history, they were the 1-2 combination at Starbucks from 94 to 2007. Period of fast growth at Starbucks. Whenever Starbucks ran into a flat spot, Schultz on the right would think, if we looked at the numbers and do the analytics, we'll find out why we hit a flat spot. Howard Behar on the left said, give me 60 days, I'm going to go out and talk to the store managers, find out what's on their mind. Simply 2 different skill sets approaching the world differently. The empathetic person, I'm going to talk to people and find out what's going on. That can be a very effective leadership style. The empathetic or the competitive analytical one with a different one. You put the 2 together and you get Starbucks. How many Rolling Stones required for a great live show? I really date myself when I put a band like that. But at least they're older than me. They don't look bad for their mid-70s, I suppose. I suppose we'll all be fooled one day, and there will be, I suppose one day there will be an obituary in the New York Times that will say, Keith Richards, 101. He'll outlive us all. And then there'll be the Keith Richards diet, and it'll be all wild turkey and cigarettes or something, I don't know. But there they are. How many Rolling Stones required for a great show? Well, of course, if you go to one of their shows, there are generally 9 or 10 people on stage. And so great teams are not only the people who get all the glory, they're the people who do the work also. This is one that's really important, and it's cognitive diversity. Now, diversity of all kinds is very powerful for team formation. Generally, we talk about diversity inside of organizations. We're talking about racial, ethnic, and sexual identity diversity, and those are really important. But I want to add two new ones to think about. And they are not competitors with the ones I mentioned. They can work together. So as companies have diversity goals, they can hit different kinds of diversity than these two other forms I'm talking about. Cognitive diversity. Steve Jobs liked to call it whole brain teams. On these small, elite, fast-moving teams that I talked about, it's really cool if you can have a person with a really good inside view of how the team works from the inside, and it's really cool to have that outside view of how the world sees the team and what are the opportunities out there. Those don't often go in the same person. It's really good to have the art and science. That's what Steve Jobs is one of those rare people who kind of had a foot in both worlds, but he made sure that he had Apple, his team at Apple, he had the artists and he had the scientific types. You have the intuitive and analytical types, in other words. And then age diversity, I think, is going to be increasingly important. How do you take the experience that boomers and older Gen Xers have and help skill up millennials and Gen Zs so that millennials and Gen Zs aren't blocked by all these boomers who refuse to retire and Gen Xers, but actually have a path up. And the boomers and the Gen Xers can move into a new phase of their career where they're mentoring and coaching more. Great opportunities there. But these are some of the cognitive, other kinds of diversities. Insider and outsider, Fred Smith will tell you the best board of director he ever had, a board member he ever had, who served for 19 years, is Judy Estrin, who looked nothing like the good old Tennessee and Mississippi boys who were on the board at FedEx. FedEx is based in Memphis. So she was the first woman. She's an academic from Stanford and UCLA. She served on their, really good with network computing though, and she served on their board for 19 years. She did such a good job. She was on Disney's board for another 20 years after that. He will tell her, Fred Smith will tell you that's the best board member he ever had because she was an outsider and she was a she. But primarily, it was the outsider that interested him, and then he got the she as a bonus. Turned out it was a great win for FedEx. Or you take art and science. I love hippie capitalists. I love people who build organizations starting with hippie values. And there were a lot of those. Steve Jobs is one of those people, and Mike Sinyard, who built a company called Specialized Bikes. If you're a hardcore cyclist, or you follow the Tour de France, which is on TV, a lot of them, it might be the preeminent American brand in cycling right now, Specialized Bikes. And Mike Sinyard was a hippie capitalist who sold his Volkswagen bus to fund his company. And at the time, this is way back in the 70s, the only American bikes you could get were cloddy bikes like Schwinn's. And I mean, the European bicycle movement hadn't caught on in the US then, and he thought he could make it happen, and he did, and he built his company with these hippie values. Well, today, as I said, they've got Tour de France teams, a lot of other professional teams, and hippie values doesn't quite cut it for a professional team. You also need really great, measurably good bikes, and they do that too. So if you go visit their headquarters, they have wind tunnels and all of that science. So it's the merging of science and art that makes Specialized an enduring company. And then the last one is wisdom. This is one of the best selling books of the last 10 years called The Boys in the Boat. It was about, Daniel Brown wrote it. It was about the 1936 University of Washington crew team. And against all odds, they became the best crew team, 8-man crew team in the United States. All their competition on the West Coast was Cal and Stanford, which had elite schools with elite crew backgrounds. Then on the East Coast, it was a completely elite school-dominated athletic field, Ivy League schools and the military academies. And so this is a story about these Depression-era poor kids from the University of Washington who pulled this upset and won the national championship. And then they went to the Berlin Olympics and they beat the Germans with Hitler watching. The whole team went because they took the whole team, got to go into be the 8-man team at the Olympics. And he wrote the book, Brown wrote the book at a relatively advanced stage. It came out when he was 62. It was his first big book. And he said he couldn't have written The Boys in the Boat when he was younger because he would have lacked the wisdom to write it. He would have lacked the layers. Part of the wisdom was seeing what it was like with these poor kids competing against the rich kids. And the poorest of the poor happened to be their best rowers, a guy named Joe Rance. He wrote the book around a man named Joe Rance. Joe Rance grew up in a family that was so poor the family couldn't feed him and kicked him out at age 12. So you think about this kid fending for himself. Somehow he makes it to the University of Washington, but he's got real trust issues. His whole family kicked him out. And in rowing, you can't just be a great individual rower, it's how you row as a team. It's called the swing. You know, you've got to have the swing. Everybody's got to be rowing at the same time. And so the story about Joe Rance being the poorest of the poor and kind of how he finally made the turnaround and began to trust is a layer that Daniel Brown, the author, says he wouldn't have seen until he was older. This is Elkanan Goldberg, a neuroscientist at NYU, who says he's 72 now. I talked to him on the phone last week. He says he's coming up with better insights today than he did when he was younger, even though the brain is supposed to get worse and worse over time, which is a fallacy. He says he has faster insights today. It's almost unfair how he's able to put his analytical and his intuitive side, you know, just sort of come together with these flashes that he didn't have before. This is the world's top artificial intelligence company investor. He was ranked the #1 venture capitalist in the world by us at Forbes. In 2014, 3 years ago, he started an AI-only fund. He invests in AI companies in China and the United States. And he said, I said, what's the difference, Jim, between investing in software companies that you used to do and now investing in AI? He said, wisdom. If you're going to be a great AI company today, you've got to incorporate wisdom. Teams must be interdisciplinary with diverse views from the very start. So here we've gone down this track over the last 30 years where we bet it all on STEM and getting our kids to get the highest math SATs that they possibly can. Because that's where the future is. Well, it isn't. I mean, you need great STEM people to design AI, but you need really good people. You need diverse views embedded into that AI, or the AI is just going to be this kind of savant, you know, that will, like Rain Man, be able to do these amazing calculations in a phone booth, but won't really be able to help you out on some of the more complex problems that the world is facing in the future. Intelligence is not enough. What you want from AI is a higher order, wisdom. The race goes to the wise, says the world's preeminent investor in AI. So now I just want to move to this last little speculative part about growth and late bloomers. Wisdom without growth is idle speculation. I mean, it's great to have wisdom, right? But, I mean, the world beats us up. We get older, we have wisdom. It's applying that. We kind of want to apply that. You know, harness it to something useful. Take us where we want to go. How do we hitch wisdom to growth? Now, that's Carol Dweck. She looks like Edna Mode in the, doesn't she really? She's, you know, she teaches freshman psychology at Stanford. She wrote this incredible bestseller called Mindset, came out in 2006, sold 2 million copies. CEOs are reading it. Satya Nadella, Microsoft recommends it to everybody. I just think that give her those glasses, man, and I'm telling you, it's Carol Mode out of The Incredibles. Growth requires discomfort is the operating theme of mindset. We either have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. Growth requires discomfort, but how can we get ourselves comfortable with that discomfort? Visited her office at Stanford about 1.5 years ago to ask her these things. She said something really amazing, because I was giving her this, I was saying, you know, this early blooming obsession that we have in the United States with putting kids on this conveyor belt that only goes toward high SAT scores and high grades and cuts off these paths of discovery you know, and all these other latent talents out there. I don't think it's doing us much good. What do you think? And she said, I don't either. And she said, what do you see, I asked. She said, the Stanford freshmen I see today are more exhausted and brittle than 10 years ago. Now, can you imagine that? She's seeing 18-year-olds who have won a big prize. They got into Stanford for crying out loud. It's like going to an Ivy League school, except it looks like Club Med. And you can drop classes 2 weeks before the final. They won't let you screw up once you get in. I mean, there's heaven on earth. It's probably that university. And the people who got in, who won the prize, are feeling brittle and exhausted. Like, don't give me any more. I can't take any more. I've had all the pressure I can take. So she's developed this drill for her Stanford freshmen, Frosh, that I get every one of them to pledge to do something that is completely against type. So if they fail, it won't hurt their self-worth. You see, these students, because of us, because of people like my generation, putting the pressure on these kids, their early blooming accomplishments are so tied up with their self-esteem that they won't put their self-esteem at risk. And therefore, they fall into a fixed mindset at an all too early age. They're so used to following, you know, what other people have said to do. So I got to break that mold, she said. The only way I can do that without getting people to hurt their self-worth is to give them a task that goes completely against type so that they screw up. So she got this incredibly shy young man to run for student president of his housing unit, or freshman president of his housing unit. The shyest, pathologically shy, you know, treatably shy. Shyness is really holding back this kid, and he did it. And he won. And he comes back every year, and he does a guest lecture for it, changed his life. Now, he wouldn't have tried that if it had been, you know, he was a superstar in math and this, and if the challenge had been related to that which he was already successful, he wouldn't have done it because of that brittle factor. You know, don't put one more brick on my, you know, shoulders. But if you do something almost against type and almost silly, where if you fail, you can all laugh about it, takes the pressure off, and that's what he did. And it changed his life in a positive way. And then she has another thing that's really great. Recognize that about change, because to grow you have to change, and that means putting up with discomfort. Recognize that part of your brain wants to protect you from change. So when that little voice shows up on your shoulder and tells you you can't do this thing, you know, you'll be embarrassed, they'll laugh at you, whatever that nasty little voice is saying. She said it's a mistake to ignore it. If you hear advice, just ignore it. Well, you can't ignore it. It's there all the time. It'll show up when your guard is down. What you need to do, she said, is acknowledge that voice. Thank that voice for showing up. I know you're trying to protect me from change because change can be painful. But you know, this time I think you're wrong. So have a seat over here and shut the hell up. I think that's pretty good. That's better than ignoring it. It's really cruel, by the way, when you hear Carol Dweck saying that, and she starts dropping profanity bombs because she's about 4'10" and she looks like Edna Mode, so it's all the more delightful when it comes out of her mouth. And so the bonus trend is the vitality of late bloomers. If this were a 12-step group, I would say, my name is Rich and I'm a late bloomer. I know a little bit about 12-step groups, so I've heard about 12-step groups, so that's what I would say, knowing about them. That was me at age 9. I had big dreams about my future. That was me at age 18. I had a bad attitude about everything. It was really captured in that photo. If you take a look at my hand in my pocket, I'm flipping the bird with my left hand. Why? Because it was sort of the in-jerk thing to do in that period. There were a couple of Miami Dolphin players that did it surreptitiously on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and then it became kind of the thing to do. And it was a real bad attitude thing to do, and I thought, well, you know, I'll do that. So that was me at age 18, and I was a terrible student. And I went into a deep, dark hole. When I was 25 years old, I was still washing dishes, a night watchman, doing stuff like that for a living. I had not come out of that. I was very slow to mature, and my brain, the executive functioning skill was not coming together. Then finally, in my late 20s, it began to bloom. That's the '84 Olympics. But you see a healthier person than that person who was flipping the bird to the camera. F. Scott Fitzgerald said there are no second acts in American lives. He was an early bloomer. He wrote, The Great Gatsby came out when he was 25. That's pretty early. He died at 44. So he's right about his own life. There's no second act for Scott Fitzgerald. And he was really wrong. He really, I think, implanted a wrong idea in the United States. I really think there's a time for a late bloomer revolution. All these Carson Wentzes out there. Carson Wentz of the Philadelphia Eagles was not ranked coming out of high school. In high school, the college had these ranking systems, 5-star recruit, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Carson Wentz had an NR, no ranking. You know who else had an NR, no ranking? Tom Brady. Now, football has all these paths of discovery. Eventually, if you're good, you will be discovered. Life does not have that path of discovery. So the question is, of the students you run into, or the peers that you run into, or perhaps even yourself, who are the Carson Wentzes out there who have not yet been discovered? They have these latent skills, but an NR ranking, because this conveyor belt of success didn't recognize it and didn't even want them to recognize it, because it was only going in one way. And that's why I say I think it's the vast majority of people. I think we have so much talent on the sidelines or underused, and so many people that feel vaguely frustrated or unfulfilled. You know, they may be fully employed, they may be somewhat happy, they may be on the outside, look like they're doing okay, but they haven't, their full promise as a human being, their purpose of being put here on earth, it hasn't quite come together in the way that it possibly could. And man, if we could tap that, because I think the majority of people are of the late bloomer revolution side, we could do a lot. We're living longer. People think technology, that older people can't get it. I think this might be coming down to the last slide, a couple slides. This is Laura Germain. At what age? Vinod Khosla, one of the co-founders of Microsoft, very successful venture capitalist. People under 35 are the people who make change happen. People over 45 basically die in terms of new ideas, he said. What age? I'd like to see a show of hands. What decade of life do you think our brain peaks? 20s, raise your hand. 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. It's a trick question. As Laura Germain at Harvard revealed in 2015, it actually depends what kind of cognitive skills you're talking about. Cognitive processing speed, learning, remembering names, working memory, pretty early. When we fall off of our peak, we go down very slowly, about 0.02% per year in the beginning, and we only go over a cliff at the very end. Facial recognition memory, early 30s. Social understanding, 45 to 55. Verbal knowledge, 65. We become better and better and better until the very end in all kinds of pattern recognition sorts of capabilities. So we lose it very slowly. I said 0.02, it's 0.2 and 0.4, but that's still pretty slow. Those are the two founders at Google. Google age myth, nobody over 30 does good work. A comedy was made out of that when Vince Vaughn and Owen Wilson tried to get jobs as 40-somethings as interns. Google Facts, that's their Vice President of R&D, Vince Cerf. That's their Chief Futurist, Ray Kurzweil. And then I mentioned Diane Green, who runs Google Cloud. So the myth and the facts don't line up. And Vinod Khosla is simply wrong about that. Last question, Angela Duckworth, who wrote the best-selling book Grit. At what age does grit peak? What decade of grit peaks? Another trick question, it never peaks. It keeps getting better and better and better as we get older. And the reason is we become more selective about where we apply our grit as we get older. We don't waste our grit in trivial things. We apply our grit to things of real deep purpose as we get older. So that's my book coming out in March 2019. I think it's time for a late bloomer revolution to really get everybody else and not just the 800 math SAT scores in the game. And that's all I have to say. And thank you very much for your time and attention.